Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to get back to work on this 383 stroker, get the pistons put on the rods, get the rings file fit, and hopefully start sticking some pistons in the engine. A quick update, you'll see the zero turn mower is gone. It had a broken connecting rod, a broken piston, and gouged the cylinder wall. So it was given to me, I passed it on, gave it away. The guy that's got it, I don't know, he may find another used engine to put on it, but I'm certainly not going to mess with it. Something else I want to discuss briefly that I didn't cover on my last video. When I checked the clearance, I used two methods. I mic'd the crank journals and used a dial bore gauge to check the inside bore with the bearings installed, and then I also used plastic gauge. And I didn't really go over the plastic gauge. I guess maybe kind of assume everybody knows what it is, but it's a small wax filament that you put on, and then you torque down your cap, and it mashes that plastic, and then by comparing it to this gauge you determine what your clearance actually is. Measure the smushed plastic filament, and that tells you what your clearance is. It's something I didn't really go over. My plastic gauge said I had about 2/1000 of clearance. It looked to be dead on 2/1000, and my other method using the mics and the dial bore gauge said I had 3.5/1000. And that may seem like a pretty big difference, but it's not as big as you would think. When you look at how the plastic gauge is measuring, it's only measuring one side, which is called a radial clearance. So it's just measuring one side between the crankshaft and the bearing. When you mic it and use a dial bore gauge, you're actually including both sides of your clearance. So if you take that plastic gauge and double it, you would have 4/1000. I actually had 3.5/1000. That means the plastic gauge was only 1/4 of a thousandth different from the actual measure miking it, which I think is pretty close, and to be honest could even be my my interpretation of trying to read the chart against the smushed filament. So I wanted to go over that, and then there's this one video clip that I forgot to include in my last video of checking the thrust clearance, and I want to give you a quick look at that. Okay, I've got my dial indicator set up here and zeroed, and it looks like I have about 4/1000 of thrust movement back and forth. 4/1000 is what I'm seeing. Okay, you can see that's zeroed there, and now I'm going to pry it. Using the counterweight on my crankshaft, I pry it one way. And pry it back. Zero. Reading it upside down with my glasses on. I see that as 4/1000. I've washed and dried all my pistons. They came marked already with the weight in the black. You can see the weight from where they were balanced. The red markings are my markings as to the cylinder I plan to put each piston in. If you look at the crankshaft, when this first rod journal is at bottom dead center, then that means the rear rod journal is at top dead center. They oppose. And the same goes for the two middle rod journals. They're on opposite sides. So it makes sense to me that I need to have the front two pistons add up to an equal weight to the rear two, and then also that these two be as close as possible. Again, this is a fully balanced, race balanced assembly, and the people that did the balancing wrote the weights on each piston. So if you look, the ones I've got here for 1 and 2, I've got 466 grams and 466.5 grams. There's a half a gram difference there. If you go to the other end where the opposing rod journal is, I've got 466 grams on 8, 466.5 grams on number 7. So those two journals are balanced end to end, and they're also balanced from one side to the other. So then I tried to do the same thing on the two center journals. I've got 466.4 grams and 466.1 grams, which add up to 466.5 grams. Both of these are 466.2 grams, which is only a tenth of a gram difference between the two center journals. And there's only a tenth of a gram between this and the end journal. So as I go through here side to side and left to right, I don't have any more than a tenth of a gram difference between all these journals. Okay, I've got all my parts washed. I didn't realize how much engine building required washing with soap and water. But I've got all my pistons washed, dried, and marked. Got the wrist pins washed and dried, and the connecting rods. I've got my Spiro Locks here. The connecting rods came with this ARP lube, but that's for the cap screws. So I'll just be holding on to that until I put the rods into the block. If you look at the connecting rod, you'll notice there's two faces. This side is very flat. The other side, if you notice, there is a chamfer on the inside. That chamfer is designed to go against the outside edge of the crankshaft. If you look at the crankshaft, you'll notice that it's curved at that outside edge, and so it's curved on that outside edge, and so that's where you want the chamfer of the connecting rod. So it goes this way. The flat side is where the two connecting rods match up to each other, so the one on the other side will go like this. When I put my piston on, those valve reliefs go toward the top of the block, toward the lifter valley. And so I've got to make sure I get my valve reliefs on the piston oriented correctly so that the chamfer on the rod is oriented correctly. So I've learned that the valve reliefs always go up and the chamfer always goes on the left hand side of the rod. If you do that, even though you have opposing pistons, if for instance this piston is correctly oriented to go in the number 1 cylinder, but if it were going in the number 2 cylinder and I turn it around for the number 2 cylinder, the valve reliefs are still up, and if I were standing on the number 2 side, that chamfer would still be on the left. So as long as I put all these pistons together with the valve reliefs up and the chamfer on the left, then I can use any piston for any hole. Okay, that was my first time using Spiro Locks or this tool, and it took a little bit to figure it out, even though I read the instructions, but I think I've got it. Valve reliefs up, chamfer it to the left, and I'm not sure how this is going to work. I want to put some assembly lube on the wrist pin before I put it in. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to use these gloves or not, but we'll start with gloves. Chamfer to the left. Just check again. Valve reliefs up, chamfer to the left. Insert my wrist pin. These are full floating wrist pins. Full floating pistons. If you want a complete breakdown on the parts that I chose for this engine, it's in my 383 What Does It Cost to Build video. I'll put a link in the description, but I go through the crankshaft, connecting rods, pistons, all the components that I have so far in that video, what I chose and what they cost, and the options like the race balancing, what that cost. So feel free to check that out. There's one done. Okay, note to self. Double check, triple check, quadruple check to make sure you have everything correct before you put in that second Spiro lock. Somehow I screwed up. I got it backwards, and it took me probably 30 minutes to get that Spiro lock out so I can switch this around. I'm sure I could do it a little quicker now that I've done it once, but trust me, it is not something you want to do. You only want to put those Spiro locks in once. Okay. Valve reliefs up. Chamfer on the left. I've got all my pistons on my connecting rods. I started doing this myself. The wrist pins, it's a fully floating wrist pin, and they use Spiro locks. And there's a couple different types of Spiro locks, as far as some pistons take 2 on each side, and those are thinner. This one takes 1 on each side, and it is thicker, which makes it more difficult to install. I bought this tool which is supposed to help install them. It's a plastic tool, and the idea is that you you thread your spiral lock on here, and then you put it in to the piston, and you turn it counterclockwise, and it spins that spiral lock off. But what I noticed is this being plastic, and it's a fairly soft plastic, and those thick spiral locks, and they have sharp edges, but I did use the sandpaper that came with it and blunted those edges. But every time I thread a spiral lock on here, it was shaving a little bit of plastic off. And while this tool worked pretty well on the first few, after a while it just did not work at all. I watched some videos of guys putting them in with their fingers, and I tried that, and that didn't seem to work very well for me. So I ended up taking these back to my machine shop, and the guys at my machine shop showed me how they do it. And they use their fingers and a small screwdriver, and they had to fight it a little bit. They said this tool actually spreads the spiral lock out too much, that you do need to spread it out, but not as much. They said the fact that it was the thicker spiral lock made it a little more difficult, and also the design of this piston with that wrist pin being up into the oil ring groove, that made it a little more difficult. But they finished these up for me. They showed me how. I will definitely give it a shot on my next project. But I was very frustrated at not being able to complete that task myself. Okay, because my piston wrist pin runs through that oil ring gap, I have the standard oil ring with the center part and the two outside rings, but this piston also takes another ring, a support ring that sits here in the bottom. And what this is designed to do is to bridge that gap and support the normal 3-pack oil ring. This ring, and I don't know if you can see it or not, in addition to having a split, a gap at 45 degrees to that, where that gap is a very small detent. Now that detent is supposed to point down and sit over this opening, and that keeps this support ring from rotating, because if it were to rotate and the gap got over this this opening where the wrist pin is, then it could flex and bow, but by keeping this detent there, that keeps this ring from rotating any further than from one side to the other, and it supports those oil rings. This ring is not supposed to need to be gapped. It is supposed to be tight against the piston. It's just supporting the other rings. It should never come in contact with the cylinder wall. This center ring, center part of the oil ring, does not need to be gapped. Obviously, due to the way it's made, if it were to heat up and expand, it can actually move and absorb that. The two oil, they're commonly called scrapers, but I don't know that that's their true function. Those are supposed to be a 15 thousandths minimum. I have a 4.030 bore, and I am planning on running nitrous. So my top ring will be gapped at 22 thousandths, and my bottom ring will be gapped at 24 thousandths. Okay, I decided that I'm going to go ahead and check my piston to wall clearance before I start file fitting the rings. These are brand new micrometers, so I've never checked them before, but start by verifying the calibration on the micrometer. It comes with this 4-inch calibration, so it's supposed to be exactly 4 inches. And when I put that in and tighten it down, I see I'm about 1,000th off. I don't know whether that's the mic or the actual calibration stick, or it could even be my use of it. But I'm showing about 1,000, and that's using the 4-inch calibration stick. So anyway, I know where I am there. And now I'm going to go ahead and mic this piston. It's supposed to be measured perpendicular to the wrist pin at the bottom of the skirt here, 1.3 inches below the bottom of the oil ring. Really need about 3 hands to do this. Lock it in. And I have 4.027. This piston is supposed to measure 4.026. That's what the machine shop told me it measured. So we're still the 1,000th off, so I'm going to say that's in this micrometer. I'm sure there's a way to adjust to correct that, but for right now I'm going to continue on and set my dial bore gauge to match what I just measured on my piston, and then I'll use the dial bore gauge and check all the cylinders in the block. Alright, I'm happy with that. I've got that set where I want it. I'm sure for guys that do this every day, what I just did was no big deal. But it took me several minutes, I'm going to say 10 minutes, to get this bore gauge, even with the mic being held in a vise, to get this thing zeroed to match the piston diameter. So now we're going to go in and check, and I'm going to check several locations. My machinist told me to check it towards the bottom of the cylinder because it was honed with torque plates, and he says those torque plates will cause it to be somewhat distorted at the top. But then once the heads are bolted down, you know, then that distortion goes away. But I wish I'd oriented this gauge just a little bit differently. I'm showing about 3.5 thousandths at the top. I've got 3.5 thousandths clearance at the top. I'm showing 3.5 thousandths at the bottom. Okay, I have consistently 3.5 to 4 thousandths. Alright, I'm back to working on the engine. Had another minor fiasco putting on these oil support rings, and I don't know if I wasn't paying attention and I got started in the wrong slot, or whether it jumped on me as I was trying to figure out how to do it. But the very first one I did, I got the oil support ring up here in the groove for your second compression ring, and it was a bear to get out. I thought I was going to end up damaging my piston. I think I'm okay. I had a couple little nicks, but I hit it with some sandpaper and some very fine, like 600 grit, wet dry, and it smoothed out to where you can't feel it. But in order to get it out, the one thing I found, I broke my 9th blade. Screwdrivers were too big, but I ended up ordering and getting next day from Amazon a dental pick. I've seen other guys use these for other tasks, and it made all the difference in the world in being able to get that out. I was able to get the pick in the gap between the two ends, and then kind of get it slid under, pull out, and once I got it out, you know, to where I could get a hold of it, it was no big deal. But just getting started to get that out, it was a big deal. So anyway, I got it out, cleaned up my piston, put it back on, and doggone if I didn't get that dimple facing the wrong direction. So I had to take it off and redo it again. But it's not a big deal taking it off when it's in the correct groove. Just be very careful and don't get it in the wrong groove like I did. That dimple has to go down, and it has to be centered over the wrist pin. But after you put this ring on, you can rotate it to get that dimple where it's supposed to be before you put the rest of your oil rings on. But just make sure you've got it oriented the right direction to start with. And you can either slide it over the end, or you can spread it and go over here. What I've found is, as opposed to trying to separate this and put on like a standard compression ring, you can spin this on kind of like a Spiro Lock, and that actually seems to work a little better for me. So that's what I'm doing. I find this dental pick is very useful for moving the ring to where you want it. This is set up so that if you put the split, the gap in the ring at 90 degrees to the wrist pin, then that will put the dimple over the wrist pin. It's also, since this has to be positioned at the bottom of that oil groove, this is also very handy to push that ring down all the way around so that it's at the bottom of the oil groove. I'm getting all these oil support rings on, and then I will check the clearance on the actual oil rings. Those are supposed to be a 15,000th minimum. I'll put them straight on the piston, and then as I file fit each ring for each cylinder, it'll go directly on the piston that's numbered. I originally thought about having plastic bags marked for the rings for each cylinder and file fitting them, putting them in a corresponding plastic bag, but it just makes more sense to file fit it, put it directly on the piston, and then once I have all my pistons ready, I can start putting those in. Okay, the oil support ring is already on there. I do have that little dimple here that keeps it from rotating. I'm going to put this oil ring so that so it butts together here in the middle of this. And then so this butts together right here. So I'm going to put the gap in my first scraper ring over on the opposite side. Goes on top of the oil support ring and underneath the actual oil ring. The lighting's not very good here. Got to get some shop lights. I'll lay that piston aside and come back to it. I think I'm going to have to take those rings off and use a piece of sandpaper and go around the groove in the piston. That I may have a burr or a high spot or something that is preventing those rings from turning. Okay, last night I was working on checking the gap on my oil rings and putting my oil rings and scrapers on. And I had some trouble with the first one. Then the next two went pretty well. And then the fourth one, it just started giving me fits. I could get them on, but they didn't want to turn the way they're supposed to. All three of them turned. They were kind of frozen, like they were too tight. And of course lighting was getting dim, and I don't have the best lighting here in the garage. And the lesson I've learned, something I've learned, kind of a life lesson, is when you're doing something like that and it doesn't absolutely have to be done right then, to just walk away for a little bit. It might be for an hour, it might be for a day, maybe it's a week or even a month. But walk away, come back, you'll come back with a fresh attitude. And just like I quit working on this last night, I came back, I took all the rings back off that piston, put them back on, and I could see what my problem was, and I was able to put things back together. It went together in just a few minutes, and now everything rotates fine. Last night I would have sworn that the groove in the piston wasn't big enough for the expander, your oil ring, and your two scrapers, but that wasn't the case. It was just that things were binding a little bit, they weren't lined up correctly. Once you get them lined up correctly, everything goes together fine. So I'm going to try to get the other four pistons, get the gaps in the oil rings checked, and get those on. That piston went together like it should. Everything went on easy and it spins easily. So now that my oil rings are in, I'm ready to file fit my other rings. The box is labeled here to tell you which one is top and which one is the second ring. But in case, at least with these, I went and looked up a Molly video in case these had gotten switched around. And the black oxidized is typically your second ring, and this shiny ring is the top ring. It actually has a coating on the outside edge. So if we pull this out, you can see that it's black oxide top and bottom, but it has this shiny coating on the outside edge. There's also a dot to denote the top of the ring, and I assume these bottom rings are directional and have a dot on them as well. Yes, there is a dot on the second ring as well to denote that goes towards the top side of the piston. So I'm going to file these. The top ring, my gap is, my target gap is 22 thousandths, and my bottom ring, the target gap is 24 thousandths. Now on a stock production engine, the gap on the bottom ring may be the same or less than the top ring, but for a performance engine, my understanding is you want at least a couple thousandths larger on your second ring. And the reason for that is you get blow by on the top ring. If it's not allowed to escape that second ring, it will want to lift the top ring. So that's what I'm doing, and that's where we're headed next. My ring filer was supposed to come with a hand crank. It did not come with a hand crank, so I have it set up on my drill. I'm going to be very cautious because I don't want to take off too much. it to where I want to be until I get a feel for how quickly the drill takes it off. Now with the ring filer, instructions I've seen have said to only file one side, not to file both sides. It also said to file with the wheel turning towards the inside, that turning towards the outside could flake off the coating, which would apply to the top ring, not so much to the second ring. But so that's what we're going to do. Top side of the ring, we'll take off the left side, reverse the drill direction. I haven't touched the ring to it yet. I want to get the drill going and then I'm going to touch the ring to it. Not sure how long that was, but we will see what change it made. Okay, 17 fits easy now. Goes all the way to the bottom, but it did feel a little tight. And 19 starts, but doesn't want to go all the way to the bottom. I want to make sure I file the same side. This tool squares it up in the bore to make sure you get an accurate reading. This is 19 where we left off. It goes in easy. Goes in. 21 goes in. 22 goes in. Okay, 23 is in. And 24 is in. Again, just one little drop of oil on my fingertip, rub it between my finger and thumb, and just coat the ring so it doesn't go completely dry. Just real quick. Make sure there are no burrs on it. looks good. Dot goes up. This is my number 6 piston.